In a packed courtroom, Officer Ray Dutton testifies confidently, lying under oath about an elderly black man, Walter Briggs, claiming he resisted arrest and was found with illegal contraband, while Walter sits calm and silent at the defense table. We go back 3 weeks earlier, revealing Walter is a retired federal agent who came out of retirement for one final undercover assignment, investigating corruption inside this very police precinct, carrying his late partner's badge as a reminder of why the work still matters. The courthouse is introduced in cinematic detail. Polished benches, a gallery of officers supporting their colleague, reporters covering a routine case, and a public defender overwhelmed by a heavy caseload. Walter is publicly mocked by the prosecutor and dismissed by the judge's tone, treated as just another statistic in an overburdened system, while Officer Dutton smirks confidently from the witness stand. Flashback beats reveal Dutton has a pattern of fabricating evidence and testimony against residents in this precinct, protected by a captain benefiting financially from planted evidence arrest quotas. Walter's court-appointed public defender, a young idealistic attorney named Renee, senses something is wrong with the case and begins quietly digging, receiving a cryptic hint from Walter himself. Dutton doubles down on the stand, fabricating additional false testimony and pressuring the judge toward an immediate conviction, confident that an elderly man with a public defender stands no chance against his badge. We learn Walter has been secretly recording the entire investigation for the FBI with body-worn evidence, financial records tracing planted evidence purchases, and a federal case file that has been building for over a year. Walter's FBI supervisor and a team of federal agents enter the courtroom mid-testimony, and the room falls into stunned silence as they approach the bench. The supervisor reveals Walter Briggs is Special Agent Walter Briggs, undercover for over a year investigating this precinct's corruption, and plays recorded evidence proving Dutton fabricated the arrest and planted evidence, backed by financial records and internal precinct communications. Dutton's lies collapse in real time as the judge halts proceedings. Federal agents arrest him on the spot, and the captain's protection unravels as the wider corruption scheme comes to light. Months later, the precinct undergoes federal oversight and reform. Renee is offered a position with a civil rights law firm. Walter is honored for his service, and the story closes with an emotional message and YouTube call to action. The defendant resisted arrest and was found in possession of illegal narcotics. Your Honor, I saw it with my own eyes. Officer Ray Dutton delivered the line smoothly from the witness stand, his voice calm and practiced, the kind of confident testimony that came from having said similar words in this same courtroom dozens of times before. He didn't so much as glance toward the defense table as he spoke. At that table sat Walter Briggs, 68 years old, wearing a simple gray suit that had clearly seen better decades, his hands folded quietly in his lap. He said nothing. He didn't flinch at the lie, didn't shake his head, didn't do anything to suggest the words being spoken about him were anything other than entirely accurate. Mr. Briggs was uncooperative from the moment I approached him. Dutton continued, addressing the judge directly. When I attempted to search his vehicle, he became aggressive, and that's when I discovered the narcotics under the driver's seat. A few officers seated in the gallery nodded along, familiar with Dutton's testimony style, the kind of easy, unquestioned credibility that came from wearing a badge in a courtroom that rarely looked too closely at the officers who filled it week after week. The prosecutor, a young man clearly eager to close out another case before lunch, barely glanced up from his notes. Mr. Briggs, the judge said, addressing Walter directly with a note of weary impatience. Does your counsel have any questions for the officer? Walter's public defender, a young attorney named Renee Alvarez, stood slowly, flipping through a thin case file that had landed on her desk only 2 days earlier, one of nearly 40 cases she was currently managing. Just a moment, Your Honor, she said, though her voice carried more uncertainty than confidence. Walter Briggs sat quietly through all of it, his expression calm, almost patient, the look of a man who had weathered far more complicated storms in a courtroom full of people who had no idea who he actually was. They had no idea who they had just lied about under oath, or how completely this ordinary Tuesday hearing was about to unravel everything Officer Ray Dutton believed he could get away with. 3 weeks earlier, in a quiet apartment 2 counties away, Walter Briggs had sat at his kitchen table long after midnight, reading through a case file that had arrived by secure courier that afternoon. Walter had spent 29 years as a federal agent before retiring 6 years ago, closing out a career built on patient, careful investigative work that rarely made headlines but had, over the decades, dismantled several significant criminal operations from the inside. His retirement had been quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of adjustment that left a man who had spent his entire adult life serving a larger purpose unsure of what to do with all the sudden stillness. On his kitchen table that night sat a small framed photograph of his late partner, Agent Marcus Webb, who had died in the line of duty 11 years earlier during an operation that still occasionally visited Walter in restless dreams. Beside the photograph sat Marcus's old service badge, worn smooth at the edges from years of handling, a quiet reminder of the promise Walter had made at his partner's funeral, that he would keep doing the work that mattered for as long as he was able. When his former supervisor, now a senior official within the Bureau, had approached him 6 months earlier about a sensitive corruption investigation targeting a specific police precinct, one where a pattern of falsified arrests, planted evidence, and quota-driven policing had been quietly destroying lives for years, Walter hadn't hesitated for long. He was uniquely suited for the assignment, unknown to local law enforcement, patient enough for long-term undercover work, and driven by exactly the kind of quiet, stubborn conviction the case required. He had spent the past year building a careful undercover presence in the precinct's patrol area, documenting patterns, recording interactions, and slowly assembling the kind of evidence that would eventually need a very public moment to matter. He had chosen his cover carefully, presenting himself as an unremarkable retiree living quietly on the edge of the precinct's patrol district, cultivating small, ordinary routines that would eventually bring him into repeated, believable contact with the officers he needed to observe most closely. Tonight, reviewing his notes before another carefully engineered encounter with Officer Dutton, he had no idea that in 3 weeks he would be sitting at a defense table, wrongfully accused, watching his entire investigation reach its most dangerous and necessary moment yet. The county courthouse sat at the center of downtown, an aging but dignified building with tall windows and heavy wooden doors that had processed thousands of cases over the decades, most of them moving through with the same brisk, overburdened efficiency that defined an underfunded public defender system stretched far beyond its capacity. That Tuesday's docket had been unremarkable by the courthouse's standards, a steady procession of minor offenses, plea deals negotiated in hurried hallway conversations, and public defenders juggling case files they'd barely had time to review before standing up to represent clients they'd met only minutes earlier. Reporters rarely bothered attending these routine hearings, considering them too ordinary to warrant coverage. The gallery that morning held a small but notable cluster of uniformed officers, several of them regulars who attended court proceedings involving colleagues out of a sense of solidarity that had, over the years, quietly hardened into something closer to unquestioning loyalty. Officer Dutton's testimony was a familiar rhythm to most of them, confident, detailed, delivered with the practiced ease of a man who had never once faced meaningful scrutiny for his version of events. Walter Briggs, sitting quietly at the defense table in his simple gray suit, blended easily into the courtroom's ordinary rhythm, appearing to everyone present as exactly what his arrest paperwork claimed him to be, an unremarkable defendant facing an unremarkable drug possession charge, represented by an overworked public defender with far too many other cases demanding her attention. It was into this routine, overburdened system that a retired federal agent had quietly, deliberately allowed himself to be arrested, understanding that sometimes the only way to expose corruption from the inside was to experience its consequences firsthand. He had no idea how quickly this quiet, unremarkable courtroom was about to become the site of a reckoning 14 months in the making. The prosecutor's dismissiveness had started the moment the hearing began, treating Walter's case as little more than a formality to process before moving on to the next name on an overcrowded docket. "Your Honor," Given Officer Dutton's clear and consistent testimony, the prosecutor said, barely glancing up from his notes, the state believes this is a straightforward case. We'd ask the court to proceed toward sentencing efficiently, given the officer's credible account of the defendant's resistance. I never resisted, Walter said quietly, the first words he had spoken since the hearing began, his voice calm, but carrying clearly across the courtroom. The judge's expression flickered with mild irritation. Mr. Briggs, you'll have the opportunity to speak through your counsel. Please refrain from speaking out of turn. Renee, still flipping hurriedly through her thin case file, glanced at Walter with a mixture of apology and uncertainty. Your Honor, I'd request a brief continuance to properly review the evidence in this case. I only received the file 2 days ago. Continuances further burden an already strained docket. Counselor, the judge said, not unkindly, but with the weary efficiency of someone processing his 40th case of the week. Unless you have a specific, substantive objection right now, I'd like to proceed. Officer Dutton, still seated on the witness stand, allowed himself a small, confident smile, clearly comfortable with how smoothly the hearing was unfolding in his favor. He had testified in this courtroom dozens of times before, and not once had a public defender's thin, hurried file posed any real threat to his version of events. What Dutton didn't notice, caught up in his own easy confidence, was that Walter's expression had shifted almost imperceptibly. Not fear, but the quiet, focused calm of a man watching a plan he had spent over a year building finally begin to unfold exactly as anticipated. That small, easy smile on Officer Dutton's face would become the first crack in his entire testimony. This was not the first time Officer Dutton had fabricated evidence and testimony against a resident of this precinct's patrol area, and it would not have been the last had the wrong man not deliberately placed himself in exactly this position. Over the past 2 years, Dutton had built a quiet, troubling record of arrests that consistently featured suspiciously convenient discoveries of contraband, aggressive characterizations of compliant suspects, and testimony that rarely matched the more limited details captured on the precinct's inconsistently maintained body camera systems. An elderly retired teacher named Frank Coleman had spent 4 months in county lockup on a fabricated weapons charge before the case was quietly dismissed for insufficient evidence, with no explanation ever offered for how the weapon had ended up in his car in the first place. A young mother named Aisha Bell had been arrested during a routine traffic stop after Dutton claimed to find drugs in her vehicle, an arrest that cost her custody of her children for 6 weeks before the charges mysteriously evaporated during a docket review that no one at the precinct seemed eager to explain. Both cases, along with several others, traced back through the department's arrest quota system to the same commanding officer, Captain Russell Kane, who had quietly implemented an aggressive quota structure that rewarded officers financially for high arrest numbers, creating exactly the kind of perverse incentive structure that made falsified evidence not just possible, but for officers like Dutton, professionally advantageous. None of these patterns had ever reached beyond the precinct's own internal review process, conveniently overseen by the very captain benefiting from the arrangement. Each victim had walked away from their case believing the system had simply failed them randomly, unaware that the same officer, operating under the same financial incentive, had built an entire career on the same repeated pattern of fabrication. A justice system doesn't announce when its own procedures have quietly stopped functioning as intended. It simply keeps processing cases, docket after docket, until someone with the patience, the standing, and the evidence finally forces the pattern into the light. Walter Briggs, sitting calmly at the defense table while Officer Dutton's testimony continued, was about to become exactly that reckoning. Renee Alvarez had been a public defender for just under 2 years, carrying a caseload that regularly exceeded what any reasonable standard of representation should have allowed, doing her best each day to give every client the attention they deserved despite a system that made genuine diligence almost impossible. She had noticed something unusual about Walter's file from the moment she opened it 2 days earlier. Inconsistencies in the arrest report's timeline, a suspiciously vague description of how the narcotics had been discovered, and something in Walter's own quiet, composed demeanor during their brief initial meeting that didn't match the profile described in Dutton's paperwork. During a short recess before Dutton's testimony resumed, Renee approached the defense table, keeping her voice low. "Mr. Briggs, is there anything you can tell me that might help your case? Anything at all?" Walter studied her for a long moment, seeming to weigh something carefully before speaking. "Ms. Alvarez, I need you to trust me on something," he said quietly. "Don't push too hard on cross-examination today. Just ask enough questions to establish the timeline clearly on the record. The rest will take care of itself." Renee frowned, confused by the strange confidence in his voice. "Mr. Briggs, I don't think you understand how serious." "I understand exactly how serious this is," Walter said, his tone calm, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Probably better than anyone else in this room. I need you to trust me a little longer." She didn't know it yet, but the strange, quiet certainty in Walter Briggs's voice was about to matter more than any argument she could have prepared in 2 days with an overloaded case file. She simply nodded, uncertain but willing to trust the strange calm radiating from the man she'd been assigned to defend. Dutton's testimony, resuming after the brief recess, grew bolder rather than more cautious, apparently emboldened by the smooth progress of the hearing so far. "I should also note, Your Honor," Dutton added, addressing the judge with practiced sincerity, "that Mr. Briggs made several concerning statements during the arrest that suggested prior criminal history, statements I documented in my supplemental report filed this morning." Renee's head snapped up sharply. "Your Honor, that supplemental report wasn't included in the file provided to the defense. It was filed this morning, well within procedural guidelines," the prosecutor said smoothly, clearly unbothered by the timing. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," Renee pressed, her earlier uncertainty giving way to genuine alarm. "I haven't had any opportunity to review these new claims." The judge sighed, glancing at the clock. "Counselor, I understand your concern, but Officer Dutton's testimony has been consistent and credible throughout this hearing. I'm inclined to proceed toward a ruling unless you have concrete evidence to the contrary." Walter remained silent throughout the exchange, his composure unshaken, though something in his posture had subtly shifted, the quiet readiness of a man who understood exactly how close this moment had come to slipping past without the intervention it needed. But Dutton had no idea that the fabricated supplemental report he'd just introduced, adding invented details to strengthen a case built entirely on lies, was about to become one more piece of evidence in a federal investigation that had already been quietly building against him for over a year. He had no idea the call, in every sense that mattered, had already been made, and that a team was already on its way to this exact courtroom. What Officer Dutton did not know, what almost no one in that courtroom knew, was that Walter Briggs had spent the past 14 months conducting one of the most carefully documented undercover corruption investigations the Bureau's regional office had run in years. Every interaction Walter had engineered with Dutton over the preceding months had been recorded through a concealed body-worn device, capturing not just the fabricated arrest at the center of today's hearing, but multiple prior conversations in which Dutton had openly discussed the precinct's quota system, joked about creative evidence discoveries, and, on one particularly damning recording, directly referenced Captain Kane's financial incentive structure by name. Walter's investigation had also traced a pattern of unusual purchases linked to Dutton's personal bank accounts, small, recurring transactions at a hardware store known locally for selling the exact type of packaging materials found in several of his discovered narcotics arrests, purchases that formed a clear, damning financial trail once cross-referenced against arrest dates spanning back nearly 2 years. His FBI supervisor, Assistant Director Patricia Cole, had authorized the final phase of the operation the moment Walter's engineered arrest was processed 3 weeks earlier, recognizing exactly the kind of public, undeniable moment the case needed to ensure Dutton's fabrications couldn't simply be quietly dismissed through the same internal review process that had protected him for years. She had been monitoring today's hearing remotely through Renee's brief, coded updates, waiting for precisely the right moment, The instant Dutton's testimony crossed clearly and demonstrably into perjury, giving federal agents the cleanest possible grounds to intervene in front of the largest possible audience. The team had debated intervening earlier, during Dutton's initial testimony, but Patricia had insisted on waiting for the supplemental report, understanding that a fabricated document entered formally into the court record would leave no room for the kind of ambiguity that had allowed Dutton's misconduct to survive every previous internal review. Precision mattered as much as timing. That moment had just arrived, with Dutton's fabricated supplemental report entered formally into the court record. The truth about who Walter Briggs really was had been sitting quietly, patiently, for 14 months, waiting for exactly this moment to matter. The heavy courtroom doors at the back of the gallery opened with a sound that carried clearly through the room's tense, uncertain quiet. Every head turned. Assistant Director Patricia Cole walked in first, flanked by 4 federal agents in dark jackets, marked clearly with bold yellow lettering. Her expression calm, but carrying an unmistakable authority that immediately silenced the murmuring gallery. The judge looked up, visibly startled. "Excuse me, this is an active proceeding. Who authorized this interruption?" "Your Honor, I apologize for the disruption," Patricia said, approaching the bench with measured, deliberate steps, "but I need to formally intervene in these proceedings. My name is Assistant Director Patricia Cole, and I'm here regarding an active federal investigation directly connected to the testimony currently being given in this courtroom." Dutton, still seated on the witness stand, felt his earlier confidence begin to waver for the first time all morning, his eyes flicking nervously toward the gallery doors and the federal agents, now spreading quietly along the courtroom's perimeter. Renee straightened at the defense table, her earlier confusion finally beginning to resolve into stunned understanding as she looked toward Walter, who had risen calmly from his seat, his composure entirely intact. "Mr. Briggs," Patricia said, turning toward the defense table with something close to formal respect in her voice, "I believe it's time." Walter nodded once, reaching into his suit jacket and withdrawing a small leather case, which he opened to reveal a federal badge that had spent the past 3 weeks tucked carefully out of sight. The courtroom's confused murmur rippled instantly into stunned, disbelieving silence. "This man," Patricia said, addressing the stunned courtroom directly, "is Special Agent Walter Briggs, a 29-year veteran of the Federal Bureau of Investigation who came out of retirement 14 months ago to lead an undercover corruption investigation into this precinct's patrol division." She turned to face Dutton directly, her voice hardening. "Officer Dutton, the arrest you testified about today was engineered specifically to document and expose the exact pattern of fabricated evidence and testimony you've built your career on." "That's impossible," Dutton stammered, his face draining of color. "He's just some old man who—" "He's a decorated federal agent who has spent the last 14 months recording every interaction with you," Patricia said, holding up a tablet displaying a recorded audio waveform, "including your supplemental report filed this morning, which we can now formally confirm contains fabricated statements never actually made by Agent Briggs." She nodded to one of the accompanying agents, who stepped forward and played a brief audio clip through the courtroom speaker system. Dutton's own voice, recorded weeks earlier, casually joking about finding whatever we need to find during a routine patrol conversation with a fellow officer. The gallery's uniformed officers, who had nodded along so confidently at the start of the hearing, now sat in stunned, uncomfortable silence, several of them exchanging uneasy glances that suggested they, too, had long suspected something was deeply wrong within their own precinct. "I didn't know he was—" Dutton started, his voice breaking. "That's exactly the point, Officer Dutton," Walter said quietly, speaking for himself for the first time since the recess. "You didn't need to know who I was to tell the truth. You simply chose not to, the same way you've chosen not to for every person who stood at that defense table before me." The prosecutor, visibly stunned, rose slowly from his seat. "Your Honor, given this development, the state moves to immediately dismiss all charges against Mr. Briggs." "Granted," the judge said, his earlier weary efficiency replaced entirely by grave, careful attention. and I'll be requesting a full review of every case Officer Dutton has testified in over the past 2 years. Federal agents moved forward and formally placed Dutton under arrest on the spot, reading him his rights in front of the very gallery that had, minutes earlier, treated his testimony as unquestionable fact. His hands trembled as the cuffs clicked into place. The same gesture he had used to intimidate countless defendants now turned against him in front of an audience that finally understood the truth. Captain Russell Kane, informed of the unfolding arrest by a frantic phone call from a precinct colleague, will be formally taken into federal custody within the hour, the quota-driven corruption scheme he had built over years finally unraveling in full public view. Renee stood quietly at the defense table, watching the scene with an expression somewhere between disbelief and profound relief, finally understanding exactly why Walter had asked her to trust him. "You could have told me," she said softly, once the courtroom's chaos had begun to settle. "I couldn't risk it," Walter said gently. "Not because I didn't trust you, Ms. Alvarez, but because the case needed to unfold exactly this way, in front of exactly this room, to matter as much as it needed to. Justice in that courtroom arrived not through shouting or spectacle, but through 14 patient months finally reaching the public moment they had always been building toward. 1 year later, the precinct that had once quietly protected Officer Dutton's fabricated arrests now operated under formal federal oversight, its quota-driven incentive structure permanently dismantled following a sweeping internal reform process developed in close consultation with the Justice Department. Officer Dutton was convicted on multiple counts of perjury, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations, sentenced to serve significant federal prison time. Captain Kane faced separate charges for his role in incentivizing the department's broader pattern of misconduct, his decades-long career ending in disgrace rather than the quiet retirement he had once expected. Frank Coleman and Aisha Bell, along with several other victims of Dutton's fabricated arrests, had their records formally expunged and received civil settlement from the city, along with public apologies delivered personally by the department's newly appointed reform-minded chief. Renee Alvarez, whose quiet trust in Walter Briggs had proven pivotal to the case's success, was offered a position with a respected civil rights law firm specializing in wrongful conviction cases, a role she accepted with the same quiet, determined idealism that had first drawn her to public defense work. Walter Briggs, honored formally by the Bureau for his service, chose to return to a quiet retirement once again, though this time he kept his federal badge displayed openly beside his late partner Marcus's badge in a small frame on his living room wall. Two reminders, side by side, of a promise finally, fully honored. He still visits the courthouse occasionally, not as a defendant or an agent this time, but simply as a citizen attending public hearings. Quietly watching the system, he spent his career serving continue its slow, imperfect work of holding itself accountable. Renee sees him there sometimes, and they share a knowing nod across the gallery, two people who understood, better than most, exactly what patience and truth could accomplish when given enough time to matter. Marcus always believed the truth mattered enough to wait for, Walter said, in a brief statement following the trial's conclusion. "I just had to be patient enough to prove him right." Have you ever watched someone dismissed or disbelieved simply because of how the world assumed they should be treated? What would you have done sitting in that courtroom? Drop your answer in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe for more real stories about dignity, justice, and the quiet power of people who are underestimated.